Am I a purist? That is a question or an accusation that came up a few times during my series of videos on the Universal Monsters and Dark Universe and how the Universal Monsters don't need to be reimagined because everyone already knows what Dracula is supposed to look like. Am I a purist? And I suppose everyone is a purist about the things that matter to them. The more it matters to you, the more of a purist you are. And the less it matters, the less of a purist you are. Because somebody who isn't really a fan of Universal Monsters might not really understand why it matters that you honor the legacies of Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff by having animatronics of them, having the actual likeness. Why does it matter? Whatever, whatever. It's just old movies. They're less likely to be purist about it than somebody who cares deeply about these movies and who these movies speak to in a way that is profound and you respond to with reverence. Right? Everyone is a purist about something they care about. And ironically enough, I actually have, for as much as I have a reputation of anything online, I actually have a reputation of being very much not a purist. Um, I actually had to bow out of the online Tiki scene. And I still like individual people, but I had to bow out of the scene because it was too much drama that I couldn't stay out of because there's a lot of conflict between those purists who like Tiki is only what Mildred and Wilfred were doing in 1961, and that is Tiki. That is it. And anything new, anything different, anything where it overlaps with other sort of peripheral things is not Tiki. It's violating the spirit of Tiki. And I actually made like this little sort of map thing, trying to illustrate my views on that subject. That cultures don't have borders; they have cores, and in the core is the central idea, the orthodoxy, the thing, and that's where purists tend to reside. Is they're sort of that nail that holds down that center, and that's why they're important. The purists are actually important because they're that nail that holds the center of the thing fast, that holds it solid. But then as you go out, it starts to diffuse and overlaps with other sort of peripheral things. So you get like Tiki and monsters, or Tiki and Disney, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Tiki, Victorian science fiction and Tiki, mid-century modern and Tiki, actual Polynesian cultures and Tiki. Sort of overlap with those things. And that's important. Both of those purists and the non-purists both have an important role. The purists keep things grounded, they keep things centered, but the non-purists are the ones who are dancing around in the fringes and getting creative and doing those overlaps and inventing new things that might eventually become part of the core of that culture. And that is very much, I think, a relevant way to look at active living cultures, right? Whether we're talking like Tiki or Goth or America or whatever. But is that relevant to Universal Monsters? Because here's the thing. The Universal Monsters are a dead franchise. I said this in my video on House of Dracula versus Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, which is the actual end of the Universal Monsters, is that the Universal Monsters are a dead franchise. There are no new Universal Monsters movies. Okay, Universal Monsters are a franchise lasted from 1923 to 1960, about 72 or so films. It started with Hunchback of Notre Dame, 1923, ends with The Leech Woman in 1960, and that is it. That is what Universal Monsters are. And these sequential remakes of the 90s Mummy, Brendan Fraser, or Van Helsing, or Dracula Untold, or the Dark Universe Mummy with Tom Cruise. Those are different things. Those aren't part of the Universal Monsters franchise. They're remakes of things from the Universal Monsters franchise, but they're not Universal Monsters. So the Universal Monsters franchise, being a dead franchise, is under no obligation to to be reimagined so that new life can be breathed into it. There is no new life to be had. It's a dead franchise. They don't even make that kind of movie anymore. Right? The Mummy and Van Helsing and Dracula Untold and the other Mummy were all action movies. They weren't gothic horrors or atomic age sci-fi. Nobody even makes that kind of movie anymore. Which brings us around to a common rebuttal to what I had said, which is that There are plenty of other versions of Dracula. Dracula's a public domain character. So what difference does it make if Universal is changing it? And yeah, sure, there have been plenty of versions of Dracula, and I like seeing different versions of Dracula. But you can also distill it down. There's only really three versions of Dracula. There's Max Schreck, there's Bela Lugosi, and there's Gary Oldman. Everything else is a variation on that theme. The most recent Dracula movies, Renfield has Nicolas Cage doing Bela Lugosi. Last Voyage of the Demeter is a Nosferatu. It's a Max Schreck Dracula. But either way, Dracula Untold, that's a Gary Oldman Dracula. A Dracula where it's like the beauty of Bram Stoker's Dracula, the one with Gary Oldman in the 90s there, is that he didn't get typecast because Dracula has no one set look. Dracula is a shapeshifter. He keeps changing throughout the entire movie, from a Wallachian warlord in armor to the old dude with the hair to a giant bat thing to a giant wolf thing to the guy in the Victorian suit. He keeps changing. And you see cues taken from that to other versions like Dracula Untold or whatever. And that was the innovation of that movie as well, is that it broke out of the Bela Lugosi, pale guy in a dinner suit sort of look. And that's all fine. I love Nosferatu. I love Bram Stoker's Dracula. I love the Universal Dracula. It's fine to do different versions of Dracula. But here's the thing. Universal's version is Bela Lugosi. That's the only thing that makes Universal's version distinct. I mentioned this in my previous video on why they don't need to be reimagined. That's the one that everybody knows. That's the Dracula, is Bela Lugosi. It's the pale guy in the dinner suit. And that's the only one Universal has. That's what makes Universal's distinct from every other version of Dracula, is that it's the Bela Lugosi version. It's the version from the 1931 movie and its sequels. So why would you change that? And how far can you reimagine it before it ceases to be that? Universal themselves, had to recast Dracula. They had Lon Chaney Jr. as the worst Dracula ever, and John Carradine looking like he's dressed up in his dad's suit. And Universal has like a generic version of that Dracula. You look at like the Giada toys, for example, that are coming out, and that's a non-copyright infringing, non-Bela Lugosi likeness. It's close enough to Bela Lugosi that you can recognize as Dracula, but it's not Bela Lugosi. Or you look at the old Universal Monsters campaign from the 90s, and you have that sort of generic Dracula. And you see that generic Dracula a lot on Universal merchandise. It's the way for them to skirt around having to license Bela Lugosi's likeness to have a Dracula that's still recognizable as their Dracula, but is, again, not infringing on Bela Lugosi's likeness. So Universal can do a Dracula that goes so far, but is still recognizably their own. The problem with the Dark Universe one is that it doesn't look like Dracula. It doesn't look like their Dracula. At which point, what's the point? What's the point of Universal doing a Dracula ride where you don't recognize who Dracula is? And you have to explain to the casuals, who's that? Oh, that's the Dracula they reimagined for you. So it would be relevant to you because the classical Dracula, Bela Lugosi Dracula, isn't relevant to you, apparently, somehow, even though he's one of the most recognizable icons of cinematic history. And you constantly see merchandise that isn't even by Universal that uses that idea of Dracula. The Dracula is the pale guy in the dinner suit. So how far does it go before it ceases to be the Universal Dracula? The Dracula that Universal Studios is known for, their Dracula. How far can it go? And, I talked about Tiki before. How far does it go before it's not Tiki anymore? Right? That's why that core is important. And I guess on this question, I'm in right, like, smack in the middle. I'm in that purist space there, that nail that holds down the center of it there. And there's still room for creativity, though. Like, there's lots you can do. As long as it's inspired by that original thing, right? Like, there's nothing wrong with taking the monsters and putting them in hot rods and whatever, or like, Kong there and the Thronester, taking that original inspiration and then doing something interesting and creative with it that's still within the framework of the original franchise. whether that's the original Gothic horrors, whether that's the mid-century monster kitsch, or whatever. I mean, in the 90s, they even did like, extreme uh, monsters. They were riding skateboards and stuff around. And that's fine because it was still recognizably like Universal's Dracula shredding on his skateboard. There's a lot of fun you can have with that, with still honoring the original source material with that. And that's what I'm thinking, that this dark universe that is, again, isn't even licensed, isn't even have the logo. It's not even marketed as Universal Monsters. It's just Dark Universe, which means it probably was originally meant to work off of the Dark Universe cinematic universe that they were trying to make, that turned out to be an abortion because the Mummy was terrible. Um, like, it's not Universal Monsters. It's Curse of the Werewolf. It's a Dracula that shops at Hot Topic. It doesn't look like Dracula. It's a race and gender swapped Dr. Frankenstein. It's not the Universal Monsters anymore. And that's fine, I guess, if you're Universal Studios and you don't want to capitalize on one of your most iconic franchises. In fact, probably for Universal in particular, like specifically Universal, there's probably only really two franchises that they have that have actually stood the test of time as franchises, which are Universal Monsters and Jurassic Park. So, yeah, okay, you're Universal and you don't want to capitalize on your most well-known franchises. Okay, but then it ceases to be Universal Monsters, right? At that point, like it's not the thing anymore, which is why then, as somebody who loves Universal Monster, there they are, that loves Universal Monsters, that loves the classic horror, I'm not gonna sweat spending the money going into debt to finance a vacation to Universal Studios because it's not the thing I love anymore. It's too changed. It's too altered from the Universal Monsters. It's been too reimagined. Um, and so yeah, there's no, like I said, there's no border to it. There's no like, this is no longer the thing. But eventually, like, it when you see it, right? Eventually, it gets so far out of the way that, okay, that's not the thing anymore. And trying to update the Universal Monsters to go beyond that spirit of the classic Gothic horror and mid-century monster kitsch, it ceases to be the thing anymore. And that's when it's been too reimagined. It's gone too far. And as a purist, I like reimaginings. This shelf diorama. This where is it? This one. Sorry, I'm still trying to figure out which side I'm on here. This was originally, actually, I was going to do as a freaky tiki bar. We had all the monsters doing tiki stuff, so I could annoy both the monsters and the tiki fans. There's a lot of fun you can have with it within that classical framework that honors the original source material. This, I don't know that it does. A giant robotic arm swinging you around to see these animatronics of characters that don't look even like the classic monsters, and aren't even marketed as Universal Monsters. It's too far off the mark. It's been too reimagined, and you can compare it to, again, some other version of Dracula, A Last Voyage of the Demeter, or Bram Stoker's Dracula, or whatever. But then those aren't Universal's version, so okay. But that's not the Universal Studios monsters. It's not those classical monsters. And again, I don't even think they have to be reimagined. I think it takes more work to explain to casuals that that's supposed to be Dracula than just to use the Dracula you already have. That is the classic cinematic icon that everybody already knows. So that's my little rant here. That's what I have to say. Am I a purist about this? Maybe. Is that a good thing? Yes. That eventually it gets so changed, it's not the thing anymore. And it's not the thing that I loved. It's not the thing people recognize. And just too changed is too changed. And you can have something different. You can have a different version of Dracula, but it's just not that Dracula anymore. It's not Universal Monsters Dracula anymore.